How do you write about a lifetime of clinical depression? Daphne Merkin will join us to talk about her new memoir, This Close to Happy, A Reckoning with Depression.
I know in my head it was a whole scenario. It wasn't a realistic scenario because I was alive to see the poignant aftermath of my suicide, which was that the doorman would find me. Everyone would realize I had been unjustly treated. It was always about the aftermath.
What happens when a young Korean woman, pregnant and abandoned, emigrates to Japan? Min Jin Lee will be here to talk about her new novel, Pachinko.
She doesn't have an intention to be a permanent immigrant. And actually, most people in history don't go to Japan for this kind of reason, but this girl does.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Daphne Merkin joins us now. Her new book is called This Close to Happy, A Reckoning with Depression. Daphne has also written Dreaming of Hitler, Enchantment, and most recently, The Fame Lunches. Daphne, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this is two books in quick succession because The Fame Lunches just came out, didn't it? It feels like yesterday.
Right. It came out a year and a half ago.
Okay, so not yesterday in the real world, in the world of the book review, it feels like it came out yesterday. But that was a big book of a collection of your work. And this book you've been working on for a long time.
Forever.
Forever. How long is forever?
In real time, forever is, I'm almost embarrassed to say, 15 to 16 years.
Because I feel like this was announced a long time ago and eagerly awaited ever since.
Yes. It was, I had written a piece for The New Yorker in, I think it was 2001, about being hospitalized for severe depression and sold and had a book contract right after that.
So you were first hospitalized for depression as a child?
Yeah, although it wasn't given that billing.
What was it given?
I certainly wasn't told what I was being hospitalized for, and I know my mother, in her questionable wisdom, told my siblings, all five of them, that I had been hospitalized for, I don't know why she came up with this, for anemia, which is some blood when you're sort of...
lacking iron deficiency.
Maybe she thought it sounded perfectly, anodyne or neutral, but I don't think anyone believed her.
How old were you?
8.
And what was going on with you that she decided to hospitalize you?
My memory, and I've checked with one of my sisters also to sort of reconstruct it. I know I cried incessantly at the sort of most light of, not tragedies, the lightest incident of something going wrong. And I pretty much think I didn't want to go to school at all and was sort of dragged. But I think I was, enormously sad, distressed.
Before you were hospitalized, did you think of yourself as a sad child? Was that your own conception?
I know I felt very unhappy at home. And I know I thought about, what must be called suicidal thinking around then. I would think a lot about, I would lean out the window and think about jumping. I mean, I know in my head it was a whole scenario. It wasn't a realistic scenario because I was alive to see the poignant aftermath of my suicide, which was that the doorman would find me. Everyone would realize I had been unjustly treated. It was always about the aftermath, that somehow I'd be, sort of in my death, appreciated.
And finally be appreciated.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And what happened with that hospitalization? How long were you in the hospital?
I think it was about a month.
That's a long time
It's
for
long.
age 8.
Long. I was not put in a psychiatric unit. I was put in a children's, what was then called Babies Hospital at Columbia Presbyterian. And my memory is that I was tested a lot, talked to. Mostly I think I was sort of left to my own devices. I was thrilled, although I missed my mother or felt I had to miss her. I don't know exactly what was the real truth. I know I felt thrilled to be away from home.
What was your home life like?
I'm sorry, I take a long, deep breath. Not to put too fine a word point on it, sort of terrifying. My least introspective brother called it a fascist regime.
Mm-hmm.
It was very authoritarian, very. My parents, both of them were German, my father was remote and frightening, very remote. My mother was fairly absent, mercurial. And then we had this, nowadays they would call it a nanny. I don't know how she was referred to. Woman who took care of the 6 of us fairly brutally, I would say. By contemporary standards, abusively. She was...
Describe what she would do.
I always think, because I tend to think backwards, like what made her the way she was. So I'll just point out that she was one of 16 children herself, Dutch. I think she was overworked, overwhelmed, to be fair. I say all this in retrospect. She basically took care of us. My mother did not. So she got us ready for school. She, put out our clothes. My mother did not do any of that. And she was physically abusive.
She would hit you?
Yeah, a lot. These sort of drawn out, fairly brutal spankings.
And was your mother aware of them?
It was never clear to me.
So you just felt unprotected?
Very unprotected. She would also bang my older brother's head against the wall.
Did she ever physically injure any of you?
No. No. I mean, once one of my sisters fought back. Oh, she kicked. She also kicked us when she was angry. So, and in the book I kind of tell of a particular scene where she bangs my head against the wall because I didn't listen to something she said, and I'm not that young. I think I was about 11 or 12, and she banged my head against the bathroom wall, and I told my mother. And I don't know what my mother really thought, but I don't think she continued after that. So at a certain age, but we were all utterly petrified of her. I was, particularly.
At what point did you perceive of yourself as depressed, or use that clinical term, depression?
Much later.
How old were you?
I would say that I was maybe told it in my late teens, early 20s, when it was suggested that I go on antidepressants.
And did you?
I did, reluctantly.
Did it help?
Yes. Actually, I was put on Prozac, and I was put on Prozac experimentally before it was FDA approved. So they put me on gigantic amounts of it, with one unfortunate result, which is that I ended up needing a catheter. My sphincter froze.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Today, they wouldn't put anyone on that massive a dose.
Have you been on some form of medication ever since?
Yes. With the same mixed feelings. I remember arguing with the psychiatrist who said, you need to be on antidepressants because we need to treat the illness and then we can talk. I said to him, but I feel like I'm medicating a bad childhood. So there's a part of me that, and also the knowledge base for medication remains up until a certain point, and then there isn't a clear sense of how they work, why they work. So I always feel kind of ambivalent about it, although I've been on medication for decades.
Has depression and also the medication for it, do you feel like it's interfered with your life as a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think that's the fear.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the truth is, when you're very depressed, you can't write. Even if you're battling depression and it's not that bad, it's hard to write. I would say it hasn't. No, I should just correct that and say when I was hospitalized and was tried on something new, the very sedating antidepressants got in the way.
That 2001 piece that you did for The New Yorker about your depression, was that the first time you'd written about it? And
Yes.
Was that hard?
Yes, very. I felt it was much harder than writing about the various other autobiographical subjects I'd written about, like...
Right, you haven't been shy.
No, I haven't been shy. I think it's partly my way out.
Mm-hmm.
Like somehow if I make it clear for myself and for other people, I always felt it's a way of like opening a door onto something that I don't want to be kept secret. So as you say, I haven't been shy, and I wrote about sex and money and other subjects that have a lot of, like, a nimbus of mythology around
Taboos.
them.
Do you find it therapeutic to write about those subjects?
I wish. Not precisely therapeutic, clarifying.
Mm-hmm.
Not really therapeutic.
Was it clarifying writing this book about depression?
Yes, it actually was. I didn't think so as I waded my way through it. One of my real fears was that I would, and I did get exceedingly depressed at one point writing it.
Was that after your mother's death?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then again, I tried to go off antidepressants, and I plummeted.
Mm-hmm.
But it sort of clarified for me a little bit. I think depression is such a sort of elusive, amorphous, unpredictable creature of a disease, of an illness. It a little bit clarified for me the shape of mine, and maybe most importantly, it helped clarify for me, this doesn't sound so positive, but in a way it is positive, that there wasn't going to be a magical solution to it.
Mm-hmm.
That it would go, that I would never, ever be depressed again in that severe way. Although I hope I won't be, but I'm saying it kind of gave me more of a sense of how to navigate it.
Did you read a lot of books about depression while you were working on this?
Yes.
Was that helpful or was it daunting? I mean, how
Right.
did that affect your process?
It interested me to see how other people approach their depression. For some reason, I liked a lot of British books about depression, memoirs.
Anything you want to recommend other than your book?
There's a book by Lewis Walpert, who's a scientist, which I read with interest. I mean, you would never know that he and depression were together. Do you know what I mean? He keeps a remove.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you wanted to do in your book? Sort of collapse that remove and show what it feels like?
Yes. Collapse that remove is very well put. That is what I wanted to do. I always think of the line in Macbeth, God speak up for bastards. I wanted to speak up for all the silent, depressives, very depressed people in the world, since depression is often silent. It doesn't squeal or rant. So I wanted partly to speak up sort of on behalf of a condition that I thought went unnoticed till it imploded.
Mm-hmm.
And also that people who didn't experience it but knew people who did would have some sense of what it's really about. I think it's still easy to misconstrue depression as something you can will your way out of.
Right.
That old...
Why can't you just get off the couch?
Get off the couch, get out of bed, pull your bootstraps up. I think we still have that approach. which is fine if you're in a bad mood, but doesn't cover what depression is about.
When you're depressed and somebody comes at you with that kind of message, what's your response?
I pull further in. I think I also feel angry. I think, if I had measles or some ascertainable, a broken leg, you wouldn't just say, get up and hop, and dance on your leg. But I think it's easy to understand why depression gets, in a way, short shrift until it becomes so severe that someone threatens suicide or is suicidal. It's just hard to see it. I mean, I write in my book, and I think this is true for a lot of people who suffer from depression. I put a lot of my personality against it. I know I went to a book party, and I think 2 days later I went to the hospital, but no one at the book party could tell, because not everyone who's very depressed sort of slumps against the wall.
Is it a way of sort of forcing yourself out of the depression, or fighting against the perception of yourself
I think it's more fighting against the perception of myself. I mean, there comes a point where you simply can't go anywhere. I mean, if I feel, when I have felt the worst depressions, I basically don't get out of, barely move.
How did it feel when you finished this book, finally?
I think it felt a mixture of a relief. My own ending surprised me. I kept thinking, how would I end the book?
We won't reveal that. Let's not reveal that for our listeners.
I won't. But I think it felt like something lifted. Also because I had carried the book with me for so long, through 3 book contracts.
Wow.
Yeah. That I myself wasn't sure I'd ever do it. So there was some sense of, however small, triumph that I had managed.
We should end on that uplifting note then. The book again is called This Close to Happy, A Reckoning with Depression by Daphne Merkin. Daphne, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Alexandra Alter joins us now to let us know what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So everything is about politics these days. And last week on the podcast, we were talking about the total spike in sales for George Orwell's 1984, which is not
said, what's old.
What's old, exactly. What's decades old. It is not abated. I mean, often these things kind of pop on and off the list, but this has remained at number 1 on Amazon, and it's rising other lists as well. And when I wrote about this last week, I contacted the publisher, and they were reprinting the book, of course, furiously to keep it in stock, and they were reprinting 200,000 copies.
Wow.
They have now reprinted 500,000 copies because the demand has not diminished, and that's more than they sell in a typical year. So that's really extraordinary. And of course, there's other dystopian books, as we spoke about last week, rising as well, like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is up there. There's a sort of political satire by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which is selling incredibly well and has been reprinted. So it's interesting to see that. And then beyond the old kind of books that are resonating with our current political moment, there were a lot of book deals this week that speak to kind of what's going on in the world right now. Simon & Schuster announced that they have a book of essays coming from Hillary Clinton. It will be published in the fall, and she'll be reflecting on her experiences in the election. So that'll be interesting to sort of hear from her and see how candid she'll be about what it was like. Another book by another Clinton is Chelsea Clinton is publishing a book called Governing Global Health about healthcare, and she's co-written that with Debbie Shrindar. So another splashy book deal that kind of came out of the election probably is Van Jones, who is a CNN contributor. He was a rising star, I think a lot of people thought, with his really forceful coverage during this election. And he sold a book to Ballantine, which is a Random House imprint. And they're calling this book a manifesto for transforming our collective political anxiety into effective action. It's going to be called Facing the Messy Truth. So I think there was a big auction for that, and I'm sure that was a very competitive one. So they'll be putting a lot of resources into that. And of course, with his platform on CNN, it stands to do pretty well.
On an apolitical note, I want to add in favor of Orwell that not only should people, of course, read 1984 and his excellent essay, Politics in the English Language, but also Such Were the Joys, which is one of my favorite Orwell essays. Have you ever read it about his boarding school days and his torments there?
I love his essays, but that one does not ring a bell, so I'll have to go look it up.
Oh, look it up. It's the title is misleading. It was not a happy experience, but it's fun to read about.
And I mean, in the kind of aftermath of the Orwell sales spike, there's been an interesting back and forth with, critics have weighed in on what it means now and why this book is resonating. But there's been a bit of pushback. Some people are saying, look, this is not Big Brother. I mean, there are sort of concerning authoritarian tendencies on display, but, these parallels are not so closely drawn. So it's created, I think, an interesting discussion.
Double plus ungood. All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Min Jin Lee is here to talk about her new novel, Pachinko. Min, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start talking about this novel, for those who are not familiar with Pachinko, what is Pachinko?
It's a vertical pinball game. It's a $190 billion industry, which is twice the export revenues of the Japanese car industry.
Wow.
Yeah, so 1 out of 11 people play it regularly in Japan.
Have you ever played it?
Of course. Yeah.
Do you play it regularly?
No, because it's very expensive to play regularly. Like, you could lose a lot of money.
And is it a private industry, or does this, how does
Totally
it
a
work?
private industry.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's regulated by the police and the government very seriously for the past 25 years.
Why?
Because there used to be a lot of graft
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of corruption and a lot of organized crime and a lot of tax fraud. However, the past 25 years is incredibly regulated.
But that's not primarily what your novel is about. But
No.
but why did you choose to call the book Pachinko?
Oh, because Pachinko is one of the very few employment havens for the Korean Japanese community for the past 100 years. So then the Koreans have been in Japan for about 100 years based upon their movement there to Japan from the colonial era and also during the wars. However, due to the structural legal discrimination that they faced, they couldn't get regular jobs even if they were educated, and therefore they had to work for private industries. And Pachinko was one of the very few industries in which they would hire Koreans.
Now, you were born in Korea.
I was, yeah.
But you've told this really touching and troubling story about how you became aware of the Korean immigrant experience in Japan. Can you tell us that story?
Oh, in 1989, I was a junior in college, and I attended a lecture which featured an American missionary who told us a story about a little boy who had committed suicide by jumping off a building. And his parents went to look through his things to try to figure out why their son killed himself.
This was in Japan.
This was in Japan, and I apologize. The missionary worked with the Korean Japanese community in Japan, and so these are part of his parish. So this little boy died, and his parents were looking through his things. They found a middle school yearbook, and within the yearbook, apparently the little boy's friends had his classmates.
Friends, yeah.
I know, frenemies. His classmates had written, "Get out of this country, go back to where you belong. You smell like garlic." And they had written the words, "Die, die, die." And, of course, the parents were devastated, and the parents and the little boy were born in Japan.
And where did you sort of take that? I mean, you say that story just stuck with you.
It stuck with me. I guess it's still really very present with me today, because I think the thing that I've been really interested in as somebody who's foreign-born, who's now a naturalized American citizen, is I think what happens when the majority really hates you. How do you deal with that hatred? How do you internalize that? And how does that manifest for different individuals? Obviously, people who are hated don't all kill themselves. However, how does that affect the way you go about your life? And in my book, there are many characters who take different interpretations and paths according to how the majority feels about them.
The immigrant experience obviously is a very topical subject right
Indeed.
now. You obviously didn't plan that, because how long were you working on this book?
Well, I got the idea in '89. I started in 1996.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote it before my first book was actually published. So I went backwards.
Mm-hmm. Your first book came out in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that book called?
Free Food for Millionaires.
So you've been working on this for 10 years, more than 10
Yeah,
years.
more than 10 years, about 20 years. And I got the idea in 1989.
Did you do a lot of research?
I've read about 40 academic books, and then I interviewed almost 4 dozen Korean Japanese, plus all these other people from different industries. It's part of the way I work. I kind of work almost like long-form journalism when I write fiction, which is probably not very productive.
Were you a journalist before you were
No,
a novelist?
No,
You were a lawyer.
just a wannabe.
Tell us about the book. What is the story? I mean, there's an epic sweep here. It's 4 generations.
That's right. So it starts in 1910 because of the colonial era. Begins in 1910 when Japan annexed Korea, and it's 4 generations of one family, and they're economic migrants and there are other economic refugees who actually come to Japan as a result of the wars and because of the colonization.
And what was their experience like once they got to Japan?
Oh, well, immediately you go to an ethnic ghetto because no one else will rent to you. And you live in this tiny community, and no matter what socioeconomic background you come from, you're put into this one group because you really can't live anywhere else. They won't house you. And then
Is that official policy, or is that just discrimination that happens outside the law?
It's both. And every decade it pretty much changed for the Koreans. But even today, foreigners can't find housing. Like if you're Korean Japanese, it's very difficult to get proper housing today.
I was shocked that ethnic Koreans in Japan are required to reapply for alien registration cards every 3 years, even if they're born in Japan.
Actually, what happens is that fingerprinting requirement began in 1952 as a consequence of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And then the fingerprinting requirement ended in 1993 because the Koreans in Japan actually have special permanent residency status. But every Korean Japanese person identifies as one of 3 things. You're either a naturalized Japanese citizen, which is incredibly rare, very difficult to do, even today.
Do the Koreans want to be naturalized Japanese
First and
citizens?
second generation people feel like it's a betrayal of their identity if they do that because of their history. You can also be a South Korean citizen, which means that even though you've never been to South Korea and you're 4 generations and you actually have a South Korean passport today. Or you could be considered stateless today and actually have a North Korean identification, which means that you have a relationship with North Korea, but because Japan and North Korea don't have diplomatic processes together, still they're not recognized, you're actually formally a stateless person.
And when you interviewed 40 people, I'm assuming primarily Koreans living in Japan, do they still experience discrimination today? Do they still feel it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really interesting because they'll say things like, well, I don't feel it every single day, but then they'll tell me that they couldn't marry somebody or they couldn't visit somebody's house, and they certainly can't get certain jobs. So I think the ability to accept after so many generations of your status in life, that was really shocking for me because I've lived in America for 41 years, and I feel so fully American and like a New Yorker, and I feel very normal. So I think there's a kind of entitlement that comes to being a naturalized American citizen. You kind of think everybody gets treated this way around the world, and of course, that's not true.
How did you take this troubling history and contemporary situation in Japan and infuse it into the novel? Because obviously, it's also a very much a story, a family saga, without sort of having it overwhelm the story. Or to what extent is it important?
I think that I got the first version of the academic part out of my system because I actually did write that book, and then I threw it away.
The academic
book, because I was I'm such a obsessive person and sort of nerdy about getting things right. And as a history major, I just said, I want to get all this perfect. So I wrote that book. It was 2007. And then I went to Japan and I met all these people. And I thought, no, I really had an axe to grind. I really was trying to make a point that these people were victims, when in fact, when I met them, they were like, no, I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor, or I'm really normal. I'm just a proper Japanese person, but I have this ethnic heritage. So, for example, like Masa Son, the first person who came to visit America, Donald Trump, he's actually a naturalized Japanese citizen. However, most of Japan doesn't see him as a Japanese person. They see him as an ethnic Korean. And he actually has, I think his family's from Pachinko, too.
So you start off with this first generation that arrives in Japan. How do you take the story from there through these 4 generations, and who are the main characters?
So the main character is Sanja, and she's a 16-year-old young woman who becomes pregnant after she falls in love with a married man, and she doesn't know that he's married. And then she can't marry him, obviously. And then if she had stayed in that tiny little fishing village, she would have brought great dishonor to her family, and her mother would have lost her business as a boarding house keeper. She actually gets an offer to marry a Korean missionary who decides to go to Japan to proselytize and to serve as a pastor. And then he offers to marry her. She marries him, and she becomes a migrant. She doesn't have an intention to be a permanent immigrant. And actually, most people in history don't go to Japan for this kind of reason, but this girl does. Because when I met more Korean Japanese, there were so many reasons why the Koreans went to Japan. It wasn't just always forcible labor, which is kind of the way a lot of historians portray it.
And then what happens? Just carry us a little bit further through without giving too much away.
So she goes there and she has this child, and then she has another child by the pastor. The pastor gets sent to jail for religious persecution, which is actually what happened to so many ministers. And then you have 4 generations that grow. Both sons go into the pachinko business, both indirectly.
Did you intend for the novel to have this kind of sweep to it when you began?
My first draft actually started in the 70s, and that's a book that you're never going to see.
So far, you've thrown away 2 books in the process of writing this book.
Books.
3 books. What was the third book?
Oh, a book called Revival, The Senses, which you're never going to see.
What was that one?
It was awful. Well, I mean, you know what? Just into self-defense, I think that book is not awful because it was the first book that I wrote and I finished it, and I think I learned something from it.
Well, so far this book has gotten a lot of praise, not only from our reviewer, who writes a very positive review, but also from such esteemed writers as Junot Diaz and David Mitchell, who calls it a deep, broad, addictive history of a Korean family in Japan. And then Gary Steingart, astounding, the sweep of Dickens and Tolstoy applied to a 20th century Korean family in Japan. Min Jin Lee's Pachinko tackles all the stuff most good novels do. Family, love, cabbage. This is a Gary Steingart quote, after all. But it also asks questions that have never been more timely. What does it mean to be part of a nation, and what can one do to escape its tight, painful, familiar bonds? So this is obviously to a large extent a political novel. I'm assuming you also conceived of it really as an immigration novel.
Oh, absolutely, because I'm thinking of a trilogy. So the first book, Free Food for Millionaires, is about Koreans in America. And the second part of the trilogy is Koreans in Japan, because you really can't understand Korean history in the 20th or in the 19th century, and certainly not the 21st, without its very complicated relationship with Japan.
What's the third book?
It's called American Hagwon, and it's not going to take 10 years to write it, knock on something. And it's about the role of education and the idolatry of education for Koreans around the world.
You're not going to throw away 3 books.
Oh, dear
between
God.
This one and that one.
I hope not.
All right. Well, until then, the new book is called Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. Min, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's talk about the other people first, Greg. What's new on the bestseller list?
Well, the highest-ranking new title on the hardcover fiction list this week is being presented as a debut novel. It's called The Girl Before by an author named J.P. Delaney. It's, in fact, not a debut novel.
No, it's a pseudonym, right?
J.P. Delaney is a pseudonym for Tony Strong. That's kind of an open secret in publishing circles, and I wrote to the publisher and through the publisher to Delaney himself to ask, are you really Tony Strong? And he confirmed for the record that yes, he is.
So why does Tony say he's JP for this book?
Well, he's written under other pseudonyms before. This is, in fact, like at least his fifth novel, many of them thrillers or psychological thrillers, as this one is. He took a new name for this one. He said that there are two real reasons to favor using a pseudonym. One, he liked using the initials in this one, J.P. Delaney, because he was writing from the perspective of two different women, and he wanted to leave it an open question whether the author was a man or a woman. He said that he's been gratified that a number of readers have assumed that J.P. Delaney was, in fact, a woman. His quote on that was, in that respect, pen names have come full circle from the days when Emily Bronte had to publish under the name Mr. Ellis Bell. So now you have a male author wanting to seem maybe like a female author. The other reason that he favored a pseudonym is that it gets away from any previous expectations people might have. People who were familiar with his earlier work are coming to this book without any expectations at all. It's kind
What
of
did he write, like vampire sagas before? Or?
No, again, this is fairly in keeping with the kind of books that he did before. This is not a shoot 'em up, bang bang kind of thriller.
Not at all. Although there is violence in it.
Yeah, it's the girl before
of the
is
50 Shades of Grey kind.
It's kind of a haunted house. I mean, it's not a haunted house, but it's a tenant of this kind of showcase modernist house moves in and realizes that the tenant before her, the girl before, has died under mysterious circumstances, and it all ties into the architect at the center there. He told me that he was really interested in exploring minimalism and what he called the weird and deeply obsessive psychology of minimalism. He said that on the face of it, the KonMari trend is baffling, all that focus on folding and possessions, but he thinks that it speaks to our desire to improve ourselves, and he wanted to explore the limits of that desire. In nonfiction, there's just one new title. It's down at the very bottom of the list. It's Insane Clown President by the Rolling Stone journalist Matt Taibbi. It kind of gathers some of the reporting he did during the presidential campaign to look at Donald Trump.
So the short version of the fiction bestseller list is get away from it all. And the nonfiction is
get away.
Get away.
Or soak in it. All right. What are you reading, John?
I'm reading a new memoir by a woman named Macy Halford called My Utmost, a devotional memoir. Macy is someone who I met in passing a couple of times several years ago when we were both books bloggers. She was doing it at The New Yorker. I was doing it in my living room. And she grew up evangelical in Dallas, Texas, which is somewhere where I lived for several years. So I'm kind of interested in that in general. And she grew up reading regularly this daily devotional book called My Utmost for His Highest, which is by a Scottish writer named Oswald Chambers. And I guess among evangelicals, this is considered almost, like a secondary Bible, and it's something you read every day with sort of passages that he writes and also shares biblical passages. And as a sort of for someone who's essentially a non-believer, I'm very interested in writing about religion and spiritual experience. And she writes about her grandmother and her mother and sort of how religion was passed down to her, how she held on to it even after she moved to New York City, what that experience was like. And I'm about 100 pages in, and what she's going to do is kind of go back into history and figure out things about Chambers and about the writing of the book. But so far, it's just been a really lovely memoir about her childhood and about her time early in New York City. And it's also, and Lord knows why I would need this right now, but it's a very gentle, calming book. So it's been nice to read, at night, kind of unplugging from the news. And I just wanted to read one paragraph because obviously the people involved are big characters. And her mother, there's this very kind of odd but funny moment where she's a child and she goes to her mother's bedroom door at night and she leans down on the ground and she looks through a vent at the bottom of the bedroom door at her mother. And she says, I would lie on my belly in the darkness and watch her for a moment while I drank my milk. She was always the same, afloat on her queen-size canopy bed, enthroned by a dozen fantastical pillows. Pillows with green silk ruffles and paintings of nude women in the bath, pillows in the shape of a ball or a cylinder, pillows with white feathery strands like eyelashes. Propped up on these pillows, a single pink Velcro curler atop her bright blonde head, she would read, cracking sunflower seeds between her teeth. The Bible sat on her knees, just above the big plastic cup she used as a spittoon. When she was done, she would floss, drop the strand into the cup, switch off the light, and begin to intone her prayers, whispering into the darkness.
That's lovely.
Yeah. Greg, what are you reading these days?
Well, unsurprisingly, I am still reading The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, that giant...
Second installment of 46.
Yeah, I'll be talking about this book for a long time.
This is going to make Pamela's Hamilton look like a weekend read.
That's right.
2021, we're going to be hearing about this.
Listeners may remember that last week I had just made it out of the introduction. I was still in the final pages of the introduction to The Power Broker. So you'll be happy to know that I am through the introduction now and into Robert Moses's early life. Caro backs up and talks about Moses's grandparents and his parents, drawing a lot of parallels between what their interests were and what Moses would go on to do as a developer and as an urban planner. He also, interestingly, looks at the social situation of Moses's family as immigrants to America at a time that there was just a huge influx of Jewish immigrants. And then at the tensions within the Jewish population, as the German Jewish immigrants started to shift over to Russian Jewish immigrants.
When did his family come over?
In the early to mid 1800s, I believe.
Oh, okay.
And again, Caro talks about kind of social trends in terms of a lot of Jewish settlers became door-to-door salesmen or pushcart peddlers. That was not the case with Moses's grandparents, and they were established in America with some money already from their parents. So
it's funny to think of him as such a mid-20th century figure, and then to think about the obvious influence that the 1800s had on him, since his childhood was really spent.
Yeah, he was born in the late 1800s himself. He was born in 1888, and one of the things that, apparently I haven't read Caro's LBJ biography, but one of the things that he is very good at is looking at the larger social context to see how it forged somebody's personality.
Yeah, I haven't read much more than the sort of beginning of the LBJ books, but it's really good at that.
I saw him give a speech at the National Book Awards this year when he won the Lifetime Achievement Award, and he talked about how he realized in writing the LBJ books at some point that he wanted to write about how the Texas Hill Country had formed LBJ, much in the same way that I'm saying that he talks about how Jewish immigration helped form Moses's character here. He wanted to do something similar with the LBJ books. And he didn't know anything at all about the Texas Hill Country or its social context. And so he told his wife, we're going to have to move there. And they ended up living there for at least 3 years, I think. And they had to sell their house, in the New York suburbs. And her only comment was, couldn't you have written about Napoleon?
I have to say one of my favorite experiences was going to Bob Caro's office, which he has kept he's kept the same office for many years in Manhattan. He gets dressed in a jacket and tie to go to his office every day, and he has hard copies of all of the books that he uses as references, with all marked up with little notes and Post-its and things in them, and it's just like stepping back in time.
I remember some years ago, Sam Tannenhouse wrote a profile of Bob Caro, and the detail that jumped out at me there was the bulletin board with all of the elaborate handwritten notes kind of tracing the path that the narrative would take.
Also fun to read is Bob Gottlieb's take on editing Bob Caro, which is an interview with the Paris Review that's available online, and then in his his recent book, Avid Reader.
What are you reading, Pamela?
So I've been trying to stick by my New Year's resolution to read books that are not especially absorbing, but that I can kind of like dip into, the kinds of like self-help and how-to and impulse buy books that I'm always like, I'll read those another time, because I just feel like I don't have the space to get absorbed by a narrative. So I was doing pretty well. I finished the Marie Kondo. And I moved swiftly on to Siblings Without Rivalry. My children are not listening, so they don't know this. Actually, there was a moment where my older son noticed the book in my bag and was like, "What's that?" And I felt like I was like hiding like 50 Shades of Grey or something. I was like, "That's nothing." But it's by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslish, and it came out like 20 years ago at least, but I think is still one of the great parenting books. Their follow-up to How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk, also a great book. Anyway, then I got sidetracked into James Lasden's memoir, Give Me Everything You Have, which
That's the stalker memoir.
That's the stalker memoir. So that was not part of my theme of of escape and betterment. That was kind of a dark read because that's, of course, his story of being stalked by a former student and sort of all the havoc that person wreaked online and offline to try to damage his reputation and his life. So that was not uplifting. I also read The Examined Life, which was one of your recommendations, John.
Yes.
And,
I hope I didn't waste your time.
No, you did not. I think, Greg, you also read it.
I read it several years ago, yeah.
These were case histories of by a psychotherapist in London,
Stephen Gross,
about his patients, but they're kind of written like short stories, and it's not
very in keeping. It's kind of the psychotherapy version of Oliver Sacks's The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
Yes, but I felt like they're more open-ended in a way.
They are also in a very psychotherapy kind of a way.
And now I'm reading a book that I picked up. I sort of want to read it to see if my daughter might want to read it, so I'm pre-reading it for her. It's a book by Eleanor Roosevelt from 1960 called You Learn by Living. My daughter's middle name, Eleanor, is after Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a little kind of how-to guide, how to live guide, really. So far, it's lovely. I think that it's no secret that Eleanor Roosevelt had a very miserable childhood. So she writes a little bit about that and about the repercussions that it had on her psychologically and sort of how she got out of that. And I'll just read one teeny little excerpt here. She grew up basically living in fear of everything. And so she writes, though most of my early life, that childish fear persisted, the terror of displeasing the people I lived with. I look back now with amazement on the dreadful day after I was married. Franklin had given me one of his precious first editions to look at. In some inconceivable way, I tore one page a little. I held it in my hands while cold shivers went up and down my spine. Finally, I made myself tell him what I had done. He looked at me with bewilderment and some amusement. If you had not done it, I probably would. A book is meant to be read, not to be held. What I had dreaded, I don't know, but I remember my vast relief. That was the beginning of my becoming more mature about my fears of displeasing people. And then she writes, the encouraging thing is that every time you meet a situation, though you may think at the time it is an impossibility and you go through the tortures of the damned, once you have met it and lived through it, you find that forever after, you are freer than you ever were before. If you can live through that, you can live through anything. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are able to say to yourself, I lived through this horror, I can take the next thing that comes along. So far, it's looking pretty good for my daughter as a recommended read. Whether she follows that recommendation is another
She'll
matter.
have to come on and talk about her reaction to
That's
it.
right. All right, John, Greg, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
This episode of Inside the New York Times Book Review is co-produced by Vanessa Romo and Jocelyn Gonzalez, and this marks a goodbye from us to Jocelyn, who has been a long-standing producer here, but is cruelly abandoning us for the lucky host and listeners of Studio 360. The absence of errors and the appearance of continuity and high quality on the show is all due to Jocelyn. So many thanks to Jocelyn Gonzalez, and welcome to Vanessa Romo. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.